Hmm.
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am fabulous. So, let's kick off Monday morning with some cool talk about Cream City Conservatory and what does it mean to design or what does it mean inequity in development and design? So, good morning, everybody. Today is Monday, October 5th. We are officially in October fall weather, scarf weather and all that beautiful stuff.
I'm not ready yet. This is, yeah, I was hoping for a few more weeks of warmth, but it, such is life.
We'll get it. I think we have one more weekend left. And
Mhm.
so welcome, August Ball.
Thank you. Thank
Welcome to
you.
Designing Healthy Environments.
Yeah, thank you so much. And people get this mistaken all the time. It's actually Cream City Conservation.
Oh,
But
I'm so
no
sorry.
worries, no worries. Very similar words.
Yes, so we're going to be talking about Cream City conservation, learning more about you, about what you do, the important work that you're doing, and when it comes to designing healthy and equitable communities, like what exactly does that mean? And so, quick introduction: I am Alicia Ponce, founder and principal of APMonarch. We are architects and sustainability consultants. And so this morning we have August Ball to talk about, how she contributes to designing healthy communities and making them equitable, because we're no longer just focusing on the energy efficiency of a building, recyclability of materials, um, carbon reduction. All of that is important, but it also includes, the equity piece. And where does that come in? So, August, please take it away.
Sure, sure. So, well, thank you again so much for having me on your podcast. First of all, Cream City Conservation is a two-pronged social enterprise. So we work with predominantly environmental organizations, helping them address their different cultures and practices that might be keeping them racially homogenous. And then we use the profits from that work to offset the cost of our conservation core programs. Nearly all of our core programs are partnerships with local entities, either nonprofits or government entities. We have programs that engage young adults, predominantly of color, in trail building, forestry, green infrastructure, urban agriculture, climate activism, and social policy. We also, engage young people in outdoor recreation too, and make sure that they understand why it's so important to protect our natural areas and our waterways for generations to come. We are based here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but we do our consulting work nationally and internationally, actually.
Wow,
Uh,
that's incredible. That
mm,
is incredible. Like, why is it, I mean, it's important, right, to us, but why is it important to you specifically? Why did you start, embark on this mission?
yeah. So, I got my start. I'm a sociologist by training. So I'm a social scientist. I love data, but I also love people, and I love the intricateness of people and the different personalities. And I love watching teams develop and function. And my introduction to the outdoors came very young. I grew up in the Philippines on a farm. And if you know anyone who's ever grown up on a farm, most likely they will tell you the first thing they wanted to do when they grew up was not be on a farm and not do physical labor and dig in dirt. However, sometimes you can't escape it. When I came back to the States as a young adult, I noticed a very stark disconnect between young people and nature due to this concrete jungle, if you will.
Yeah.
Read a book called Last Child in the Woods and completely drank the Kool-Aid. And I started to realize how our built environment impacts young people, specifically young people of color, how lack of engagement in nature contributes to risky behaviors, lack of dopamine being released in the brain, But what I also notice is that it's not that young people or people of color are not interested in the outdoors or don't care about environmentalism. That's quite a myth that is unfortunately continues to perpetuate. People of color have been engaged in the outdoors forever. In fact, indigenous communities have been land forever. Black and brown people have been camping, fishing, hunting forever. um, Unfortunately, with the design of this concept of wilderness, which is very much so a white male frame, the contributions of people of color have been historically gone unrecognized. Oftentimes their intellectual property stolen. However, it's important to me because currently people of color are disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards.
Right.
And yet when we look at who is holding key leadership roles in the development industry, real estate, in the environmental organizations, in policymaking institutions, it is predominantly white men. The demographic that is the least impacted by environmental hazards.
Mm-hmm.
So that alone is a key issue. I will say, however, that lack of representation of our actual population is actually a problem amongst most industries, tech, healthcare, law. So there's a reason for that, but there's a reason that we can consequently design an equally as intentional process to undo a lot of those harms that have produced the current status quo.
Right. And it's like, in what you do also, the education piece, the data piece is also really important in how you may perhaps initiate conversations, and even like that education process is throughout, and that is like super essential in, you know, to have that conversation. But as you probably very well know, like when you work with certain organizations or all organizations, you can talk about that, it's like it's an uncomfortable conversation, right? And what does that mean, like when you walk into an organization to talk about why the inequities exist and people just get uncomfortable? But I mean, now is the time to have those conversations, right?
Well, yeah, I think first we have to understand why people are uncomfortable.
Yes.
And the whole reason why people are uncomfortable having conversations about race, which then leads them into having discomfort around all, you know, forms of inequity around social identity, such as gender, sexual orientation, ability, class, religion, is because of a system called, you know, white dominant culture. And white dominant culture is something that we are all swimming in. It's a system that has been put in place since the 1600s that essentially says whiteness is the norm and everything else is the other. And this creates an experience for folks who are white identified to not see themselves as racialized beings, to not be able to recognize how their lives are impacted or not impacted based on the color of their skin. I want to be clear, and your viewers may and listeners may already know this, but race is not a real thing. It is a social construct. It was designed to essentially perpetuate and support, quite frankly, some unjustifiable acts of colonizers. And so I don't believe in that it's about, you know, blaming, you know, white people. White guilt is completely useless. None of us who are alive today, you know, created these systems that we are operating within, but it is our duty currently to recognize these systems, to dismantle them, and to build up something better that is equitable for all of us. And speaking of equity, we are still working to create shared language around this, right? So it's important to note that it's not all people who get uncomfortable having conversations about racial inequity or representation or diversity or just race in general, right? It's typically white identified people who are uncomfortable. People of color are raised in a world where they're very much so made aware of their identity and how their identity is going to inform their experiences through education, through the workforce. just going about their day-to-day lives.
And
So
then sometimes it's like whether we like it or not.
exactly. I can't tell you how many clients I've had where I've done, interviews with their staff of color, and you find out that the staff of color signed up to be a marketer or an educator for bird watching, and all of a sudden they're because they're the one person of color on staff, they're now charged with like running a diversity committee. And while they care about this stuff, they're it's like this isn't in my wheelhouse. I'm not like skilled in this, but two, this isn't even what I was hired to do, but all of a sudden now this is on my shoulders because I'm the one person of color. And so we have to understand that diversity is everyone's job, but also this is the key difference between inclusion and equity too. Many companies will tout that, oh yes, we have 50% people of color. My question, this is where the data comes in, how many of those people are in leadership positions? How many of them are in your C-suite? How many, or are they mostly relegated to clerical positions? Because right now in development, I would say about 80% of senior level positions are held by white men, followed by white women at 14%. So we have a lot of work to do, but the other thing that I think that's keeping us stuck is that we've created this environment, this culture where it's taboo to talk about race. It's taboo to talk about these inequities, which only serves to maintain the status quo. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm giggling because and we have an executive order to deal with, right? August. It's like, how did that impact you? Has that impacted you? And it's just pretty incredible to deal with something like that. That why is this an awful thing to do all of a sudden?
And I'm assuming you're referring to the executive order of the current administration around barring diversity education for federal agencies. Yes. So, it's interesting to think about why certain things become banned, right? I oftentimes will question why we don't allow for information to be dispersed. And I think it's quite un-American, if you really think about it, to essentially bar information from being distributed. So what it has done actually has made organizations and companies even more diligent in addressing this because they see this as fascism. Even those who, there's a very big difference between identifying as conservative or Republican or progressive and Democrat. Not that that's the two binary spectrums. Most Americans are not so binary in their perspectives. Most of us, our perspectives, political leaning, are quite intersectional because we don't live one-dimensional lives. So it kind of does us a disservice to have these two very binary options. However, I think most Americans would question the intent behind prohibiting information such as this to get out to people. And when we look back at,
would you say that this ties in, like we spoke previously, and you were also mentioning how just because something is law doesn't mean it is good, right?
Absolutely. We actually have more examples of laws that have been harmful and deemed inequitable, unjust, and quite frankly, unconstitutional even, when we see the impacts that it has on, especially on marginalized communities. The Black Codes law, for example, that essentially stated that it was illegal for a person of non-white descent to not be employed. So if you were not employed, you automatically went to jail during the Jim Crow era. Redlining, as an example, prohibiting people from purchasing property or even renting in certain neighborhoods because of the color of their skin. This went up until 1968. Right? So what's important to note about redlining is that those neighborhoods, those suburbs that got billions of dollars in tax money, which by the way, everyone contributed to regardless of ethnicity and race, 90+% went exclusively to whites. And when we look at neighborhoods that were classified as most desirable back from up until 1968 until now, there's still 85% white. I'm sorry, 91% white, and 85% are classified as middle to upper class. So even with the dissolvement of that unjust law, we have not actually overcome the impacts of it. Our cities are still extremely segregated. Our brown and black children are still breathing substantially more polluted air than white children. So, and we can't even get to the promised land of a world where race does not determine one's ability to thrive, one's health outcomes, one's education outcomes, because we're stuck in a space where we're saying race doesn't matter. We're still talking about a place where, oh no, it's about social class. And that's false. It's completely false. Race is the key determining factor across all social institutions. But we wouldn't know this because the institutions that are educating us are also coming from a white racial frame of mind. The textbooks that we are reading are all predominantly written by white people. Now, again, I'm half white. I'm not against, not that absolves me either from prejudice, but I'm not, against whiteness. Well, actually, that's not true. I am against systemic whiteness. And we can all uphold systemic whiteness. That's an important note to take on as well. And systemic whiteness is oftentimes veiled as professionalism. It's veiled as, oh, this is just the right thing to do. It's the way we've always done it. But we don't often question, how did we come to think that that is the correct way to be or do or to function or to run contracts?
Because it doesn't impact us, right? It doesn't impact us in a negative way. And these laws and regulations that have been set up to be true and safe, are designed very carefully. And, we were talking about say, for example, a development in a brownfield. It has its opportunities and it has its challenges. Can you talk about that and
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so when we think about there are less than 2%, I believe, like Black architects in last time I checked, and I believe the number is even lower for maybe a little lower, a little higher.
For women of color, it's less than 1%.
Yeah. So even just noting that, right? What might that mean for how decisions are made? What kind of perspectives are probably at the tables when we're deciding how we're going to remediate a brownfield? What we see instead happening is that predominantly white companies and firms end up getting contracts that are heavily subsidized with government funding, i.e. our tax dollars. And so essentially the very descendants of people who created the problem of brownfields to begin with are now profiting off of remediating these brownfields and then setting up low-income housing institutions where people of color are going to live. And so they're continuously to design, and when I say they, I'm referring to predominantly white communities and professionals are designing where poor Black and brown people are going to live. And so it begs the question, who then are they even employing when they are remediating these, right? Is it producing a positive impact on the community? Are they employing people from the neighborhood? Most often, never. Are they using this as an opportunity to train folks and provide a skill that would allow them to be marketable? Oftentimes not. And so we are essentially just continuing these inequities by creating more wealth for those who already have it and stripping the communities that need these opportunities of the opportunity to build wealth or even just education themselves and autonomy too. I am hardly of the thought that those impacted by the decision should be making the decisions. And I abide by this even in my own company. With my staff, even though I am the CEO, those who do the work make the decisions. That is how we function, how we've always functioned. And we model that so that our clients understand this is how we do it.
That's fabulous. And then you also talked about, just understanding the inequities. If you're developing in a brownfield or, say there's a power plant going in a marginalized neighborhood versus a affluent, white neighborhood. What are the penalty differences also, penalty expertise. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're looking at things like the intent standard says that someone who is going to sue another entity for disproportionate impacts around like environmental hazards, the ownership is on the accuser to prove that there was an intent to harm that particular demographic. Um,
Mhm.
and instead, what a lot of environmental justice advocates are pushing for is essentially that the ownership should be on the entity doing the harm to prove they didn't actually harm this entity or didn't intend to. Now, again, this goes completely against the way our judicial system is set up. But let's remember how the impacts currently of our current judicial system, right? It is disproportionately impacting and imprisoning Black and Brown individuals. And so if you already come from a marginalized community, you're working 2 or 3 jobs to stay above water.
Mhm.
Oftentimes English might not be your primary language. You oftentimes may not even find out that a development is coming to your neighborhood until bricks are being laid.
That's
So yeah, so there's a lot of problems that we have here, and I want to be clear. I am not saying that but white identified people, institutions that are predominantly white, are sitting in some boardroom just concocting these evil plans, right? Like this is very much so intrinsic. This is not. It is not forefront of. I don't believe that people are intentionally trying to harm, but harm is happening nonetheless, and to ignore it, that is the crime. To pretend as though this is not happening, that is where people need to be brought to the mat. Now, let's say people are not aware that they're having disproportionate impacts, or they don't know where to start. Right now, when we look at Cancer Alley, incinerators are continuing to be established there because there's no law preventing them from doing it. And the community there is so marginalized that they don't have the ability to fight back. And institutions know this when they're setting up these perimeters. They know that they can't put this stuff in the suburbs. And the moment that they try to, there will be a slew of homeowners, ready to, and not even protesting, but calling their elected officials because they know they're in their pockets. So where so there's levels to this. There's so many levels to this. And people of color have been engaged in environmental justice for a very long time, regardless of the fact that it hasn't been recognized by these mainstream institutions.
right. Right. I mean, and that's why, honestly, designing healthy environments was created as well, for a space to talk about this, because I don't see much of it in the mainstream. And so in Chicago, we have a group called the Environmentalists of Color, where we have people from all professions in the environmental fields
Mhm.
that are making,
We need everyone at this. We need
yeah,
bipartisan support. We need intersectional occupational engagement. Yeah,
yeah.
we cannot do this alone.
Right, right. That's exactly it. And so, why don't you talk about now Cream City and the advocacy work that you do? I mean, not just like education, amazing education work that you do, but advocacy and then training the youth in your programs. Talk about
Yeah.
that. Mhm.
Certainly. So, it's interesting. It's interesting to even be a business owner right now because I spent my whole adult life in the nonprofit space. Never intended to. I come from a long line of entrepreneurs, so I guess I couldn't escape it. Again, just like farming. Um, but I actually started Cream City Conservation as a passion project. A nonprofit that I worked for decided to close their doors in the Midwest, and it left me with, hundreds of young people who had been, this fire of environmentalism had been planted, had been started, and I didn't want to lose out on them. And so while I tried to, funnel some of them into local organizations, there was still a huge gap. There was no one left really that was doing work, on trails, doing water quality testing. There were very few organizations, great ones, but few, who had the capacity to train young people for actual careers. In fact, some of these, environmental organizations would have employment opportunities, but they weren't actually really training young people for environmental careers. They were training them to be custodians. If we really looked at like what the young people were doing day to day, and that's a whole nother topic. However, what I wanted to do was make sure that the young people, and we work with folks 15 to 25 on
Mm-hmm.
different programs. I wanted to make sure that they, when they were done with our program, which different programs start and end at different times due to the seasonality of our work, that they were undeniably qualified for, at the very least, an entry-level position. And here's and what we decided to do as well is do this, again, two-prong approach. Prepare the next generation of environmental leaders, spark that interest, get them trained up, get them the certifications that they would need in order to get their foot in the door of these, water course careers, solar, soil science, conservation, and the like. And then prepare the environmental organizations, the industry themselves, to be ready to bring in, to cultivate, to retain this talent. Because
Mm-hmm.
it's not, the problem actually is not talent obtainment, contrary to popular belief. The
Okay.
problem is actually retention.
Mm-hmm.
But the key here is that most organizations never actually get that feedback because they don't do exit interviews. And even when they do exit interviews, there is not enough trust there on those talent of color who are leaving, that, the information they share won't be used against them. Uh, as an example, I worked for we'll just say a company, for about 2 years, and I was the only woman of color, and I was paid about $20,000 less annually than everyone else in the same position as I. So we rewrote my position description to actually to essentially showcase the actual things I was doing. They ended up raising the pay to be equitable and aligned with what everyone else within that tier was earning. I left that organization to run Cream City Conservation. Guess who they replaced me with? Despite, by the way, me even providing a list of talented and skilled people of color to at least interview. Guess who they replaced me with? A
I,
white person.
a man. I was gonna say a man.
A woman, but a white person. Listen, now again, this has nothing. This is has nothing. No shade, as the kids say, against this young woman's skills. She's very skilled, but it just goes to show, right? If you're already, 99% white, and you
Yeah.
have an opportunity to fill the next position, if you can't say the next person we hire will be a person of color, then what you're actually saying is we don't believe people of color are capable of this work.
Yeah, and it's also probably a way of just not dealing with that uncomfortable situation, right? Why do we have to have this conversation again?
Exactly. And it's very uncomfortable to be the only one as well,
Mm.
in the only person of your identity in that group. And what we need to have is a critical mass. We have to have enough people standing on the rug so it can't be pulled from underneath us.
Yeah,
But here's the thing: white people are harmed by white dominant culture too.
right.
This paternalism, worship of the written word, this culture of grinding and like overwork and hustling, that is so toxic to our being. It's unhealthy. It harms our relationships. It harms our ability to think critically. It harms our ability to be empathetic. And if you can't be empathetic, you can't design good things.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking that being in that uncomfortable space and being an architect, as architects, sometimes it's a puzzle, really. We as architects, we naturally want to find solutions. We have to find solutions to something. So it may get uncomfortable in our job, no matter what, because we're here presented with a problem that we have to solve. So I would hope to think that most architects are welcome these conversations, right? When we're designing equitable communities,
Mhm.
right? And it's our responsibility for those of us who are fighting climate change and reduction of carbon emissions and designing responsibly, that we would be advocates to, when we see something, to say something, right?
Mhm.
And to act on it, and to go back to our expertise, reach out to our network, and make a change.
Mhm. Well, and that's just it, right? So we can come up with the greatest solutions, but if we're not trying to tackle the actual problem, those
Right.
really great solutions don't really move the needle, right? And so we have to be mindful that we actually aren't even on the same page collectively as a community of what the actual problems actually are. And so to your point, Alicia, about seeing things and saying something, we have to be real that some people don't see the problem, right?
Yeah,
So we
yeah,
might
that's
look at
true.
a room full of white male architects and think, well, that's just natural. I mean, men are just more interested in architecture than women, which is a lie. But it's one that is very commonly perpetuated. And so it's, if you don't believe that people of a certain demographic are interested in this work, are capable of this work, it's a very easy way to absolve yourself from having to do anything about addressing that disproportionate lack of like representation.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's so true. Like it just there's so many things going through my head right now. Like we could keep
Absolutely. It's
talking.
layered. You know what? And this is where people start to
It's
get like overwhelmed, right? Because they're like, oh my goodness, there's so many problems. I'm just going to sit on my couch with my tea and rock back and forth because I don't know what to do. So what I tell people is we don't have to boil the, right? We can actually just take a moment to say, okay, what is my circle of influence? What can I impact? Maybe your circle of influence is simply your father-in-law, right? Maybe it's just an uncomfortable conversation at dinner. Awesome. Maybe your circle of influence is a board of directors. Maybe
Mhm,
your circle of influence is your neighborhood because you're involved in your neighborhood, in your community. We have
mhm,
to, here's the thing, power and oppression intersect, right? We all are experiencing, regardless of our identities, there are parts of us because of how our social systems have been designed that allow us privilege. I am a cisgendered able-bodied woman. That gives me so much privilege and reduces any struggle by so much, right? So if I pretend like, oh, I've just had nothing but struggle and I have nothing made my life easy, then I'm going to be blind to those privileges, right? But if not, if I actually am honest with myself, I can be mindful and be looking out for what about this experience is easy for me? Why
mhm.
is it easy for me? Right?
Yeah, no, that's a
Um,
great way to
and
point
exactly, and start asking who's not at the table. What perspectives have I not heard from? Am I not seeing? Right? So when we're designing an affordable housing complex, for example, are we asking ourselves, do we have anyone who even has any firsthand experience living in low income housing or experiencing housing insecurity?
out.
When we're trying to solve hunger, right? Which that's a whole nother topic, but are we asking ourselves, do we have folks at the table who actually have that firsthand experience? When we're
Yeah,
designing employment, I mean, there's, so even that alone, again, not making a one person responsible, the one person who maybe had housing insecurity one time when they were 12 at the table, we need a critical mass because there's going to inevitably be things that we are not going to be aware of. They're just naturally going to be our blind spots. It has nothing to do with our character or our cognitive ability. It's just simply not going to be an experience we'll be able to pull from. And that is why having a diverse team is so critical. Because when
right.
you have a team that has a plethora of experiences, perspectives, you make better decisions. And
Hmm.
this is why we have yet to solve climate change. It's why we've
Better
yet to solve.
farm decisions. Yeah,
It's why we design things with accessibility in mind as an afterthought. Like, well, oh, we'll just add in a ramp there. It's accessible now, right? Why don't we just build buildings and build things that are accessible from the get-go?
yeah, yeah.
Novel thought, right? But yet
Well,
we don't do that.
that's what, why collaboration and an integrated approach is so essential to what we do. And that community engagement, right? That initial feedback and insight will really inform every professional, every key person involved, and understanding why these decisions are made and learning something from it. So yeah, the community engagement piece is really important as well. And you mentioned early on about language barriers, being able to do, making sure that you're equitably engaging everyone, right?
Absolutely. And also, I would say what also keeps, I think, entities of power who have power from being inclusive in this kind of mode is that they think it's going to be inefficient, right? They have a timeline and they think we've got to get this building in the ground, by this time. And so if we have to do this listening session with the community, it's going to push us back. And I would like to challenge folks to think of this in a whole different way. Think of this as not from a lack of efficiency, but just rather this is a different approach. Why is your timeline that to begin with? Right? So you've made the timeline, right?
Right.
And you've made the
Right.
timeline based on your limited knowledge. It's
Mhm.
great knowledge to an extent, of course, right? Like if you built 1,000 buildings, you know what needs to be done, what needs to go next. But if you haven't built a building alongside a community
Mhm.
with input, by the way, that should be compensated. I don't
Mhm.
care if you're just giving folks $20 in bus fare to come and give feedback on this thing you're building. You should do that because that's valuable information. You would pay a consultant,
That is, yeah.
work that into your proposal.
Yeah.
Take
And
us changing the way we think about how we've been doing things to get us to where we want to be, where we need to be.
that's not in the budget, August. Well, who
Yeah,
said?
make it so.
Yeah.
As Olivia Pope says, fix it.
And I can say that I come from a place of privilege where these projects are designed that way, right? And I intentionally seek out these projects as well, or perhaps a client seeks APMonarch out because they know that we work this way.
Mhm.
And the end result is it just feels better. It just feels better, works better, and it's not perfect by any means because you're always going to have your bumps on the road, and from that you learn, right? But it's not going to be perfect, but it does feel a lot better, how
Feminism is those white dominant, culture attributes as well, right? Which keeps us from even trying because we think, well, if I can't do it perfectly the first time, I'm not even going to attempt, right?
Mhm.
And that magic you speak of, that feeling of like it just feels better, that's actually quantifiable. But we can quantify that into data looking at just the stress levels of people who are engaging with that space, the reduction of crime in the area,
Mhm.
the wealth increasing in terms of like accessibility to whatever it is. Like there's ways to quantify the magic, so to speak, right? That's definitely one thing I've learned from previous employment experiences, and also being a social scientist, like looking for how can we, not that everything has to be quantifiable, I want to be clear about that too, but we can absolutely quantify and measure it so that we can say, okay, this worked out really well. What worked out well and what can we recreate the next time? What do we want to leave behind that didn't serve us so well the next time we do a project like this?
Right. Yeah, you're always, just do a roundup and see of what worked and what didn't work. And at the end of the day, it's like where these projects are built, it's a sense of pride in your community. And, if you live there, you're like, hey, I did that. Or, I was a part of that. And that just gives you that energy boost or that pride boost, that to live in your community, it's safe, the air is good, the water is good, right? And it was done as a collective.
Yeah.
So
And it's safe because people have a sense of ownership with it, right? And when
ownership.
you have a sense of ownership around something, you want to protect it,
Hmm.
right? Which is why we always we as a society we tend to kind of overvalue like home ownership, because naturally if you own something versus rent it, more than likely you're going to want to, again, this is not a tried and true thing across the board, because folks who rent oftentimes get a negative connotation, so I
Hmm.
don't want to perpetuate that, but there is something to be said about having a sense of ownership, whether that's sense of ownership for a community center, a pocket park, a trail, um, whatever it might be. But having a sense of ownership absolutely substantially increases the reality that people will rally behind it. But again, think about how many community centers we see, as an example, across the nation that were put in, that were touted by very well-meaning, wealthy people that no one is occupying, no one is using, because people weren't engaged, weren't involved with it. It actually wasn't designed for how the community would have otherwise used it.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
again, not saying we should go and tear down those buildings, but we have to believe that these problems can be solved. I would not have started Cream City Conservation if I didn't think that we could solve the issue of racism. To me, racism is simply misinformation. We
Mm-hmm.
need to provide accurate, correct information to the public. And unfortunately, right now, with the mandate, as you mentioned, as more and more people are beginning to awaken to the falsehoods that they have that have been kind of infiltrated into their brains since childhood, as we are starting to critically evaluate what we have been taught to hold as true, folks who have been benefiting from these inequities, from this misinformation, are getting nervous, and they're creating laws, they're creating mandates, they're doing things to shut this down. And
Yeah.
that's something to take note of.
Mm-hmm. Wow, there's a lot to talk about, and I just love hearing about what Cream City is doing. And I'd love to hear like what you're up to in the next couple of months, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about I'm sure Cream City has been impacted by COVID, by the civil unrest and
Yeah.
climate change. I mean everything just like boom came at.
Yeah. Of all of the risk management planning I did for my business last year, this was not one of them. A global pandemic was not on the list. I think that's probably safe to say for most of us. And yet we are here. And yet, we can choose who we are going to be in this moment. And many of us are choosing to band together, to support one another, to be patient with one another, while still holding ourselves accountable to be better humans. So for us, what this meant was, rather than having 45 young people engaged in urban agriculture, in trail building, in green infrastructure training and maintenance, we only had one crew this season. We still partnered with other organizations around climate advocacy, educating young people about climate science, because that's the other issue too, right? We have a lot of these, and to be clear, my business is not a nonprofit. We are a for-profit entity that simply reinvests the profits into our conservation program.
Mhm.
My goal ideally is to get to a point where we support so many environmental orgs that this model becomes just intrinsic to who they are, and we can absolve ourselves. I don't want to be talking about racial inequity in 20 more years. Like, I would like to go and live in a tiny house with my dog. I have other interests.
Yeah.
But as a Black woman, I don't really feel like I have the luxury to not be in this to an extent, right? I don't feel like I can't just sit on the sidelines, even if I wanted to.
Right, right.
So for us, this meant reduction in our, we didn't have to lay anyone off. Luckily, we simply didn't recruit as many young people as we normally would have.
Mhm.
Um, we had to change how normally we would provide transportation for our core members to and from work sites and the office. Because of COVID, we had to figure out new protocols for that. What I will say though is that my clientele for consulting just blew up, and
Mm.
I would think that that's an amazing thing. I really enjoy working with people, especially because my specialty is working with folks who are just beginning their journey. What's challenging, however, is it's not uncommon for me to receive RFPs via email, or get a call and a client says, we want to do something about this diversity stuff, and here's how we want to do it. Will you facilitate for us, right? And I very rarely respond to RFPs, simply because my experience is, if a company knew what they needed to solve this problem, they would have done it already. And so and I don't mean that to come off egotistical, but it's kind of like if I wanted to build a building and I came to you and I said, here's how I want to build it. Here's the materials I want to use. And I've never built a building before. And I tell you, will you oversee it? You're going to look at me like I'm crazy, because you're like, first of all, you can't build a building made out of bamboo, in climate, with this height, but if I'm insistent that this is how I want to do it,
yeah,
you're probably going to say, well, I'm not the right architect for you, because that is literally impossible. So the same thing goes for addressing culture. There are very specific, each organization can be unique, but there are very specific things that companies do that keep them racially homogenous. And we do focus on race when we begin this work, despite obviously that diversity has many facets, but that's simply because the concept of anti-Blackness and racism functions so similarly across all identity factions, right? Like, racism functions just like patriarchy, functions just like elitism, like ableism, like sexism, like homophobia. It functions and sustains itself the exact same way. Folks of the who are oppressed and the folks who are privileged are conditioned socially to uphold their role in society. And so unless we can in concert essentially address the internalized oppression from the folks receiving that marginalization or being placed in a marginalized position, and we can get the folks who are actually of privilege to acknowledge the privilege and to say, okay, I didn't give this to myself. I just happened to be born and this was the system at play. But I want a world where this is not the case. I want a world where everyone has the ability to thrive just as their own independent being. If we can collectively get on that page together, then we can actually move the needle. And we can actually, once and for all, do what most people want to do, which is stop talking about race.
Stop talking about this. And then what would Cream City do?
Not be a thing. But simply not talking about it is just going to maintain the status quo, which is continuing to harm and cost literally people's lives.
Yes. So thank you so much, August. For those of you who are watching, if you have questions, if you feel uncomfortable, if you want to know more, explore that. I highly recommend getting in contact with August Ball with Cream City, and we will definitely share her information. Look her up on LinkedIn. She's on LinkedIn, August Ball. And to learn more and keep this conversation going, and learning that we do make an impact, we can make a difference, to make it better. Next week we have Kumar Jensen, and he's a Chief Sustainability and Resilience Officer for the City of Evanston. So I haven't seen Kumar in a long time because of this pandemic, but I am so looking forward to having him on and just learning about what he's doing, for the City of Evanston. He's doing amazing work on the environmental side. Great work. So thank you again, August.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I invite, if anything I said today sparks curiosity, I invite you to join me. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yes, take her up on it. Once again, I am Alicia Ponce, founder and principal of APMonarch. We are architects and sustainability consultants designing healthy environments. Have a healthy week, everybody. Bye.